town of Gudauta on the Caucasus Black Sea coast is home to a large Armenian community. Avakim Takhmazyan is 39. He went to school here, then university, and he served in the army. Now he works here too. He's lived his whole life in the area, but his ancestors inhabited a different Black Sea coastline. "300 families lived in our village, Kyukluch. It was a mountainous area between two rivers. The village had a church and 3 schools. In Soviet times, every student had a thick 48-page notebook, just like this. Avakim found this one at home, but couldn't understand what was written in it. He could only pick out a few basic phrases and numbers: 1914, 1915. The notebook contained the memoirs of his grandfather, Mardik Takhmazyan, who was born at the turn of the 20th century. Avakim's Armenian grandfather used a regional version of the Armenian Amshetsi dialect. A translator was found quite recently, so the memoirs were able to be published in Russian. They chronicle a young partisan's early years and what happened to Armenian settlements in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. It's a unique historical document. June of 1915 came, and a forced migration began. My grandfather, Mukhayel, was 98. He couldn't walk far. The Turks stoned him to death. Then Bayraz Karapet's son, Nerses, slowed down. He had a pregnant wife and a 2-year-old son. They hung him upside down and lit a fire beneath him. Mardik Takhmazyan survived, and after several years of wandering, he settled in Gudauta town, hundreds of kilometers from his native village. For many years, he lived on this street, but his house was even more modest than this, where his grandson lives now. Avakim was just 4 years old when his grandpa Mardik died, but he still remembers. They never discussed what the Kyukluch villagers endured. As Avakim grew up, he often overheard his family talking about past events in Turkey. Having read his grandfather's memories of what happened, Avakim wanted to visit his ancestral homeland to see it for himself.
Какой миссии едешь, чтобы эта миссия выполнена была, чтобы все видели, знали, как это все должно было, как оно было, что удачи тебе во всех твоих начинаниях и твоей удачной дороге.
Все будет отлично, я думаю, поеду, увижу и привезу что-нибудь оттуда.
His family and neighbors see him off. All their ancestors were born in what is now modern Turkey, but no one has ever been there. It's hard for an Armenian to travel there if they're looking for traces of what happened in 1915. The tragedy that contemporaries had for so long failed to name has a special significance for every Armenian family. Even 100 years later, when Turkey's holiday resorts, classic art and traditional cuisine are famed throughout the world, there are Armenians who still have trouble even buying a ticket to Istanbul. Avakim Takhmazyan picks up his rental car like any other holidaymaker. But he won't be visiting the usual tourist attractions.
Почему решил приехать сюда? Это желание было давно. Как-то не складывалось все оно. То одно, то другое, все как бы оттягивалось.
His travels in Turkey, once the Ottoman Empire, will take him to far-flung provinces and way back into the past. By 1915, World War I was well underway. The huge Ottoman Empire fought on Germany's side against Russia. There were Armenians living on both sides of the border, in the Russian Caucasus and the Anatolian Peninsula. Armenians were called on by both empires to join their respective armies. The Ottoman army was under the command of Enver Pasha.
Enver Pasha's fault to attack in the winter with no good clothing. He said he couldn't believe that. So that is what he said, that the Turks were lost the battle just because the Russians were better or something. Gave information of our movements to the Russians.
The Ottoman Empire was nearing its end. Following the Balkan Wars, it had lost nearly all its European territories, and many of the provinces that remained were pressing hard for independence. The empire was a prison of different peoples. The government viewed ethnic minorities, especially non-Muslims, with suspicion. Turks called their capital Istanbul, while to the rest of the world, it was still Constantinople. With a population of more than 1 million in the early 20th century, it was one of the biggest cities in the world. The capital was home to intellectuals from all ethnic groups: Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, and Greeks.
The genocide was a huge betrayal on top of everything else, because a lot of the leaders that were giving the orders out, Talat Pasha, the Minister of the Interior, for example, was close friends with the Armenian leaders.
Talat Pasha, the Interior Minister. Enver Pasha, the Minister of War. Jamal Pasha, the Naval Minister. They were the radical ruling party leaders. They dreamed of a new country in which there was no place for anyone but Turks. They had no idea what fate awaited them in just a few years. Meanwhile, the war that continued to rage provided an ideal smokescreen. On April the 24th, the government arrested hundreds of people in the capital, then thousands throughout the country. Armenian lawyers, doctors, politicians, teachers, and priests were detained and then banished to far-flung provinces. Many were killed. The Armenian national elite were completely eradicated. April 24th would later become Remembrance Day, commemorating all Armenians killed in the Ottoman persecution. When the empire collapsed and the Republic of Turkey was formed, its founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, branded the persecution of Armenians a disgrace. But he also laid some of the blame on the victims themselves. His grandchild agrees.
They lived in Turkey together for 1,000 years, you know. I mean, they wanted, actually the West is what it is. They pushed them away, English and everything, you know. They were, oh, you can get your own country and everything. You know, they tried giving all that stuff, and what happened is pushed against the Turkish army. What they would do, you know, your country would have, somebody was from the behind, it was attacking your army, and they want to get some food. They cannot get it because the Armenians are packing it up, blowing the bridges up, people dying over there. And the Turks actually didn't go out and, army-wise, they didn't go out and kill them, nothing. You know, actually, they could do that too. But they didn't do that because Ottoman Empire, what they did, the Ottoman Empire had a lot of faults and everything. But in this case, they didn't do bad. You know, what they did is, they decided to move the people out of there. You don't know who did it. I mean, children think cold. Turkish army died over there from the cold. Army didn't have heavy clothes.
Mass deportation on ethnic grounds and accusing an entire nation of betrayal are tactics that would be used more than once in the 20th century, and not just in Turkey. But towards the end of May 1915, it was the Ottoman Empire that became the first in modern times to target an entire race.
Ասին որ հայերին պետք է տեղահանել եւ տեղահանության ժամանակ ապահովել նրանց անվտանգությունը, պետք է բնակեցնել նոր վայրերում, օգնել որ նրանք կարողանան այնտեղ նոր կյանք սկսել եւ այլն։ Բայց հետեւյալ արտահայտությունը կա կառավարության որոշման մեջ, որ հայերին պետք է տեղահանել նրանց ձգտումները անջատվելու։
The phrase "final solution" was one that would be heard again in the 20th century and remembered forever. But it was first used in 1915. Subjects of the Ottoman Empire, though, had yet to hear of the final solution. The number of Armenians who were born before 1915 is dwindling rapidly. Only a handful remain and are still able to describe what they saw with their own eyes. Khachik Pepesyan was born in 1910 in Kapisia village on the eastern Mediterranean coast.
Իսկ ոնց փախակ, ինչով փախակ, ձիով փախակ, էշով փախակ, նավով փախակ, ոնց փախակ։
Էշով էլի փախտեն, որ բլի հետային։
Ձեր հին տնից ինչ տարակ ձեր հետ։ Շորեր տարակ մենակ։
Շորեր, բա ոնց։ Շորեր հավաքեցին, ելան կլացին։
Դու լացում էիր, հիշում ես, լացում էիր, թե չէ։
Չէ։
Բա մաման, պապան լացում էին, թե իրանք չէին լացում։
Անպայման։
Armenians who lived in the Ottoman Empire engaged freely in trade and were often better off than their Turkish counterparts. At the same time, like other non-Muslims, they were denied many political rights and were banned from senior positions and carrying weapons. They couldn't even testify in court. The government suppressed any uprising by Armenians. Mass attacks targeting Armenian communities had happened in the empire before, but the final solution sanctioned by the government in 1915 would affect every Armenian family. Yepraxia Aganesian was born in 1910 in a town called Kazan.
Փոքր երեխամուն մի եղբայրմունի մի եղել 3-4 ամսական այդտեղ թուրին փերանը մեծ քարմը գա եղել տատիկները գրեցին այդտեղ երեխային թողեր են ու գնացել են իրենք երեխան այդտեղ մնացել է ուր բիտանի հետը երեխան պիտի բորա ցայնը պիտի ելնե թուրքերը պիտի լսեն ուքրնեն պիտի սպաննեն լստիպատ երեխային թողեր են այդտեղ
Official correspondence between the Ottoman leaders and local governors sheds light on the deportation process. 600 secret telegrams sent over 2 years are now kept in the Turkish National Archive.
From different regions, but not to Syria and Iraq, where they sent the Armenians during the genocide. So 1914-15, Armenians were relocated from certain areas basically towards inside of Anatolia. There were political reasons or military reasons for this before the beginning of the war.
The Statistics Department at the Interior Ministry was responsible for overseeing the mass deportation. Around 300,000 Armenians arrived in the Syrian desert as a result of the enforced migration. Future historians would note that more than 1 million Armenians died.
Garmi biberunin yağır hava pirin neren. Türkiye'nin gerisi şıbırdı mı var?
Իսկ դուք չեք ուզում ասենք մի օր գնաք տեսնեք ձեր այնտեղ քաղաքը, ինչ ա մնացել, ինչ չի մնացել։
Չէ, հա, ով գիրթա։ Ով գիրթա այնտեղ։ Էտա ցերկերենին, հա։ Փլադնի կտպանն։
Northern Turkey, close to the Black Sea. Avakim Takhmazyan's ancestors were born not far from here. There seems to be no trace left of the people who lived here 100 years ago. My father was a partisan. My mother gave me to one of my father's Turkish friends. He was called Mustafa. My uncle gave his 9- and 8-year-old sons to another Turk. We'd graze cattle together, but we never spoke Armenian. Gendarmes heard about the brothers and brought them to the nearest rock, where they cut off their heads and threw their bodies off the cliff. Soon I ran to the forest to join my father.
Здравствуйте. Трабзон, Кала. Трабзон, Кала, где находится? Не понимаете, да? Нет, нет. Хорошо. Поехали уже.
It's been 100 years since his grandfather walked in these forests as a partisan. And he's still reluctant to tell the locals that he's Armenian. Even though Avakim has a translator, they still weren't able to find Kyokluk village. It may no longer exist, or it's been given a new Turkish name. A town called Ordu is nearby, where they make a stop. Among the street signs and billboards, Avakim sees a monument. It carries no inscriptions, but features a clock and a very familiar pattern on its surface. It could be a recycled old Armenian monument, or part of a chapel. But he's not keen to ask. The USA was the only major power not to have joined the First World War by 1915. The US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople, Henry Morgenthau, represented the interests of several countries that were fighting against the Turks. American consuls reported the atrocities that accompanied the deportation of Armenians throughout the country.
He had the consul's reports. He had his meetings with the Turkish leaders. And he talked to ambassadors and other non-official people who were in Turkey. And he gained a lot of trust of all of them.
Pamela Steiner talks about Henry Morgenthau, her great-grandfather. Following in Henry's footsteps, she became an activist for Armenian genocide recognition. As if these 100 years had never happened, generations now talk to each other about the events of 1915.
He had the role of being, while he was ambassador, of trying to stop the genocide. He really did. He talked to everybody, ambassadors. He also used reports from ambassadors for his knowledge. But he tried very hard to stop it, and he couldn't stop it. And he was very, very unhappy about that. And he decided the United States had to get into war, so he returned to the United States, and he worked on President Wilson to join the Allies in fighting World War I. But for the Armenians, he also did something kind of amazing. For a former ambassador, he started a non-governmental organization to help take care of the Armenians.
Henry Morgenthau was among the first to tell the world about the Armenian suffering. The highest-ranked witness to the tragedy, he wrote a book, The Murder of a Nation. That was the first attempt to recognize a crime that, at that time, still had no name. The book is based on materials the ambassador gathered over his 3 years of working in Constantinople. And in 1919, Morgenthau played himself in a feature film. The 1.5-hour movie called Ravished Armenia screams of atrocities from the screen. These shots would often be used in the future as documentary footage. Thousands of Armenians who fled to the US from Turkey played a part in shooting the movie in California. The film is based on a bestseller by Aysharus Mardiganyan. A 14-year-old girl experiences the death of her family and then deportation. Mardiganyan played herself, and in this shot, she's second from the left.
Մի դրվագ կա հետաքրքիր, նա պատմում է, որ մենք 19 աղջիկ էինք, որոնց տարան սպանելու, երբ հետո պարզվեց, որ խաչերը 18-ն են պատրաստել։ Բոլորին խաչեցին, ես հետ վերադարձա, որովհետև մի խաչ պակաս էր։ Ամերիկա եւ Ամերիկայում պատմել իր պատմությունը.
However, the infamous footage of crucified girls doesn't reflect the whole truth. Mardiganyan later explained that Armenian girls were raped before being tied to cross-shaped stakes. A girl sits on a lake shore with mountains behind her. This is how another witness to the events of 1915 represents Turkey in her art. There's no place for tragedy on her canvases. Yelena Abramyan was born in Kars in 1909. Yelena tried to flee the persecutions and leave Kars with her family. Groups of Armenian refugees were often attacked by what they referred to as death squads.
Մարդիկ գալիս վազում են, ես կանգնած։ Տեսնում եմ, որը բարձրանում, ես չեմ մտածում, որ այդ մի գնդակը կողքը կգա, բայց կարող եմ ոտից ընդերից ընկնել իմ ծուրը։ Չեմ ըմբռնում, արդեն գիտակցությունս ծրել իմ տեղում չի։ Հերվից մի մարդ ոյով շինելով երեխաներին փրկող է եղել։
Armenians fled their homes in terror. Some were killed. Others found refuge abroad, and their property was simply taken over by new owners.
Ermeni meselesini ele alırken, Ermenilerin imhasına yönelik politikalar uygularken maddi kaynakları da bir Türk Müslüman burjuvazi yaratmak, çünkü inşa etmek istedikleri Türk ulus devletinin çeşitli vesilelerle Balkanlardan ve Kafkaslardan gelen muhacirlere dağıttılar.
Near Kars town in Turkey, the journey back in time continues. Avakim Takhmazyan, the partisan's great-grandson, is still looking for traces of Armenians who lived here long ago. His grandfather never returned to Turkey, so how does he feel seeing this landscape?
Нет, это не усталость. Я бы еще ездил бы. Это не усталость. Это какая-то тяжесть, которую вот видишь, и она давит. Вот именно то, что произошло, те события, которые были, они оставили свой след и неприятный след.
Many villagers didn't stay for the day of forced migration and fled to the woods. Others who managed to escape the horror of persecution returned and also hid in the woods. With the women and children, there were about 60 of us. To arm ourselves, we would kill gendarmes and take their weapons and ammunition. So we got stronger, but our main strength was the woods and the mountains where we lived. The walls of Takhmaz Kala were built by Avakim's forefathers. The Takhmaz family stronghold was destroyed in the 8th century and looked just the same 100 years ago as it does today. But it is at least an Armenian trace, something to remember.
Похоже, это каменные фрески, которые остались от руин старой крепости Тахмазян. А здесь, по всей вероятности, был колодец когда-то.
When people still lived in the fortress, the duduk would often be heard playing within these walls. Nothing depicts the nation's soul better than this pipe made from apricot wood. World-famous musician Jivan Gasparyan once toured Turkey.
Եվ տարան Դիարբեկար իրանց բանով է, բայց հայկական քաղաք է, եւ երբ որ գնացի տեսա ավերակները ղշերի մեջ է, բայց քրդեր էին ապրում եկեղեցու մեջ։ Եվ ես հարցնում են էքսկուրսիա ես խնդրեցի, որ ինձ տանեն անգլիացիների, իտալացիների եւ ֆրանսիացիների։ Եվ իրանք պատմեն, ես ինչ պատմություն է։ Սա մեզ մեր եկեղեցին է, հայոց եկեղեցին, այս քաղաքը հայոց քաղաք է եղել։ Իրանք զարմացած էին մնաց, ասում էին
Repsimir Haji Sargsyan was born near Constantinople in the village of Kutakhya in 1911. Her family fled to Bulgaria. Running from the persecution, Repsimir's family saved St. Stephen's holy relics, and it wasn't easy getting them out of the Ottoman Empire.
Kapele. Bitte tanem yes. Bitte tanem. Kapele. Veatan gamgar. Yekeretsun tıgan entek hasele. Anderet hayastan peri. Esi. Ete topur gıvele. Çene vodki takı pinterorei.
The church allowed the Repsimia to keep the relics at home. Deported or fleeing Armenians tried to take their most precious possessions with them. But they had to leave behind their churches, mountains, and snow-covered Mount Ararat. A masterpiece of Christian architecture still stands near the Armenian border, on the tiny island of Akhtamar on Lake Van. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross dates back to the early 10th century. In 1916, deprived of its monks and parish, it was abandoned. But the 21st century restoration of ancient churches brought this Armenian memory to the Turkish government's attention.
Aman yani her gün de geliyor yani 1 kişi, 10 kişi, 7 kişi. Ermenistan'dan 3 gün önce 7 tane minibüs geldi yani yaklaşık 150 kişi.
Turkey has no diplomatic relations with Armenia. The border is closed. But Armenians are able to travel there via Georgia. The country is rich with stone carvings, as well as reliefs and murals, all alongside typical Armenian writing. They, like all traces of Armenians in Turkish history, serve as a reminder of the cruelty of 1915.
Çok sorunlu. Tabii Türkiye'nin en büyük tartışılmayan meselesi bu diyebiliriz. Tabii ki eksik yönleri var. Tartışmanın farklı boyutları, farklı şekillerde tartışılabilir. Fakat Ermeni soykırımı Türkiye'nin güncel bir problemi olarak tartışılıyor.
Staff at the Holy Cross Cathedral will happily tell you where, among the murals, you can find David and Goliath. But they won't mention that Armenia was the first country in the world to establish Christianity as its official religion. But what of the people who once prayed here? What happened to Armenians who inhabited the shores of Lake Van?
Şimdi burada olan da var, gidenler de var. İstanbul'da, Fransa'ya, Amerika'ya gidenler de var. Burada olan da var ama kendini belli etmiyor, göstermiyor. Yani ben Ermeniyim demiyor. Ama şu an burada çok az. Yani sayılar çok az.
In 1915, Armin Wegener, a German officer, accompanied troops from Constantinople to Baghdad. Because he was a medic with an Allied army, he was allowed to visit the camps set up by the Turks to contain Armenian migrants. Wegener had his camera with him.
He used to write to his mother, telling all the terrible thing he was going, and he was forced to go back to Istanbul and put in a cholera camp, where he nearly died.
Wegener survived. His photographs were confiscated, but he did keep some films and returned to Germany. When the war was over, he started writing.
Well, imagine you walk over a country and you see one man killed, 200,000, 100,000, and it's continuously going on. It comes into yourself. You can't get any longer rid of it. And when my father was crying, as I told you before, the memory, the inside memory, didn't give him peace. And he has been, in some way, a destroyed man since then.
Wegener spoke of what he'd seen, but he did remain objective. He pointed out how some Turks had refused to follow their orders. Using photographs he'd taken and documents sent to him by various Armenians, he published a book in which he accused the Ottoman government of mass murder.
And they're horrific. You see starving children on the side of the road. It's something that we need to get through, but we need to do it with justice. And Turkey's got to live up to its own history, and because otherwise we're not going to let it go.
This journey to the past is reaching its end. Avakim Takhmasyan failed to find any trace of his grandfather in Turkey. He'd promised to bring something back from the ancestral homeland for his neighbors and friends.
А что я увидел в своем селении Кеглов? Ничего не увидел. Реально ничего я не увидел там. Все изменено. Только одна вот эта часовня и не часы, что посередине стоят, кольцевую сделали. Вот она что-то напоминает о существовании армян на той местности. Больше ничего я там не увидел. А там и жили все, весь мой род, и однофамильцы жили. Что я делаю? Я землю беру, чтобы отвезти на родину свою.
We were preparing to flee to Russia. We captured several rich Turks and forced them to lend us money for the trip. Armenian villages were empty. There were no houses or occupants. There were 300 Armenians and 300 Greeks among us. The Laz people had 3 boats. One had a motor, the other 2 did not. We installed motors, got aboard, and were saved. In the last month of 1923, we alighted not far from Sochi. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and Ataturk became president of the newly born Republic of Turkey. Armenians, though, who'd spent the last 8 years in the woods as partisans, saw no place for themselves. It seemed they'd never set foot on this land again. How could they live in this country after all they'd been through? A village called Vakifli is shown on maps of southern Turkey, on the border with Syria. Residents know it as Vakif, the Armenian name, because the villagers are really Armenian. It has 35 houses, a church, and a hotel. It's the only Armenian village on Turkish soil.
Ինչպես որ բոլոր աշխարհը գիտե, հոս տեղահանություն եղած էր Օսմանյան գազության ադենով ուզեցին որ մուսալերան հայերն մոտավոր
մամաս դադս գիշներին թուզ բան հասկը թխեին գիշերը որ թուրքը չիտեսնի խփիրես գիշերով Tuz havakային ամարեր, tuzը, խաղողը, սեպետը ուսելի վրա, լերը կհանեին գրվողներին, որ ուդեն։
Բաշը խպել են, բանենարը, նղանք է, առավոտը ոտը պացվել է, այդպես կրեր են, բան նավեր դեսնում են աչկոբու, մոլ է գացել է այդ գաշտալոց, մոլ է գացել է,
The French and British evacuated more than 4,000 people from Musadak in 1915 in what was the largest Armenian rescue operation.
Kalk giderim, giderim, fenerimi yok giderim.
Nektar Alatuzyan was born near Musadag, where the first fight against Turks continued even to the mid-20s.
Գյուղի ժողովուրդ, եկել են հրացանները պիտի տանին, նայում են, աստեղ հրացան չկա։ Բանը եկան, ասեն հրացան չկա աստեղ, սպասեք ասի գա հրացան, եսալ։ Որ ասեն ես ինչ աղջիկ է, ինչ խելք բիդեց, գեդինը փռերը հրացաններ խալեն փռերը վրան։
Even after the war, the persecution continued, but the civilized world had, by then, lost interest. The murder of a nation wasn't considered a crime from the law's point of view. It wasn't until 1944 that lawyer Raphael Lemkin suggested the term genocide. When he spoke of its victims, he referred mainly to Jews and Armenians.
1939 թվականը, երբ Օբերզալցբուրգում գեներալների հետ հանդիպման ժամանակ Հիտլերը մի ճառ է արտասանում, հրամայելով ոչնչացնել բոլորին։ Չինգիզ խանը ժամանակին ոչնչացրեց միլիոնավոր մարդիկ եւ ստեղծեց կայսրություն եւ մնաց կայսրության մեջ։ Եվ նա ասում է, մտնելով Լեհաստան, ոչնչացրեք բոլորին, կանանց, երեխաներին ոչ մեկին մի խնայեք։ Ով է այսօր հիշում հայերին։
These days, there are only a few tens of thousands of Armenians in Turkey. Journalist Grant Dink became one of the most prominent at the end of the last century when he focused on the topics of genocide and reconciliation. 3 times Dink was prosecuted for denigrating the Turkish nation, and in 2007, he was killed by a Turkish nationalist. Fethiye Çetin defended Dink in court. Her book, My Grandmother, went through 11 editions in Turkey and will soon be published yet again. Her grandmother confessed on her deathbed that she had lived her whole life with a Turkish name. But she'd been born to an Armenian family, and in 1915, at the age of 9, had found herself on death road.
Yol boyunca kadınlardan, çocuklardan ve yaşlılardan çok ölen oluyor. Hamileler ölüyor. Diyarbakır'ın Çermik ilçesinde geldiklerinde bir onbaşı, bir asker anneannemi evlatlık olarak almak istiyor. O andan itibaren anneannemin ailesiyle ilişkisi kopuyor. Sonra öğrendikçe aslında bu hikayenin çok doğru olduğunu fark ettim. İnanılmaz bir isyan duygusu yaşadığımı hatırlıyorum. Öyle bir isyan duygusu ki geceleri sokağa çıkıp bağırmak istiyordum. Yani bu gerçeği herkese anlatmak istiyordum. Bize yalan söylüyorlar diye bağlamak istiyordum.
The family learned it had an entirely new and different history. Grandma's name was not Sahir, but Granush. She had been baptized as a child and spoke Armenian. which she would later forget. She kept silent about her past, grew up to become a Turkish woman and married. Her children and grandchildren consider themselves Turks. But after she died, her granddaughter published a truthful obituary, to which relatives in America responded.
Anneannem o sırada okula gidiyor. Okuma yazma öğreniyor ve babasına gönderiyor. Babası da Amerika'da olduğu için babası 1915'te ölmüyor. Köyün diğer erkekleri öldürülüyor ama
Սիրելի հայրիկ և հորեղբայրներ, գուզենք քանի մտող կրել ձեզի, գհուսանք, որ ամեն բան լավ է ձեզի հետ և գաղութենք, որ միշտալ այդպես ըլլա, մենք դպրոց գերտանք և չանասիրապար գսորվինք, որբեսի գրթյալ ժարանքներ թարնանք, ծեր ծերքերը գհամբուրենք, Հրանուշ Կադարյան։
That letter from the past was written in Armenian by a young girl who didn't yet know that she'd soon be cut off from her family and her mother tongue. No one knows how many hidden Armenians there are. Official recognition of the events of 1915 would require Turkey to take a fresh look at many of its own citizens.
Quelqu'un d'étonnant quand même parce que sur la tombe de ma mère, il a prié. Il a prié en musulman, mais il a prié. C'est pour ça que je n'ai jamais rien dit de mal sur le peuple turc. Quand je parle, quand je discute de la question entre nous, je dis toujours Ankara, je ne dis jamais les Turcs.
After the Ottoman Empire was defeated in the First World War, a military tribunal was held in Constantinople with the testimonies of witnesses. Even then, the scale of the tragedy was clear. Approximately 1 million people had been killed. In 1919, the former imperial ministers, the three pashas, were sentenced to death, but they all fled the country and escaped punishment. But in less than 3 years, Enver Pasha was killed near Dushanbe. Talat Pasha was shot in Berlin, and Jamal Pasha in Tiflis, now Tbilisi. All three were killed by Armenians. This is Jamal Pasha's grandson, Hasan Jamal, a well-known journalist in Turkey. He's one more person to have broken the silence. He talks openly about recognizing the genocide and has even met the descendants of his grandfather's killer. He opens the conversation with the past by talking about himself.
Soykırımdan kurtulmuş bir Ermeni ile bugüne kadar tanışmadım ama onlara söyleyeceğim şu, onların yaşamış oldukları acıları içimde hissediyorum, onların soykırım acılarını da paylaşıyorum.
For Turks, it will clear the air for them. They will flourish much more, just the way Germany could never have moved ahead the way it has without coming to terms as well as it has with the Holocaust. So I think deeply that Armenians have to do healing on their own. They have a terrible thing fully to accept, which is how much they lost and how that there is never going to be any real justice. It can't be. Sometimes there's just terrible loss, and I think you know about that in your own country. There are huge losses and violations that have to be mourned.
After 1915, Armenians were scattered across the globe. Since then, the majority have lived outside their historic homeland. But whether in Russia, America, France, or Armenia, On April the 24th, they all remember the genocide and its victims. In Yerevan, people visit Tsitsimakabet Hill. It means Swallow's Fortress. They bring flowers and remember all who died, all who lived, and all who witnessed the genocide, as well as those who spoke out about it to the world. They want people to remember. They never want to allow anything like it to happen again.